At dawn on September 1, 1939, the world witnessed warfare transformed forever. Across the misty fields of Poland, a new kind of thunder rolled across the earth. It was not the slow, grinding advance of the Great War, but something faster, more devastating, more complete. The German war machine had unleashed a revolutionary doctrine that would shatter a nation and rewrite the rules of combat itself. This was Blitzkrieg, lightning war, and in just over a month, it would crush Poland so thoroughly that the very concept of military resistance seemed obsolete. The morning silence shattered with the roar of engines. Across multiple frontiers, columns of grey-clad soldiers poured into Polish territory like a steel tide. Behind them rolled hundreds of tanks, their treads churning the earth into dust clouds that stretched to the horizon. Above, the drone of aircraft engines filled the sky as wavebirds and fighters swept after wave of borne eastward, their shadows racing across the countryside below. This was not merely an invasion, it was the debut performance of a military revolution that would terrorize Europe for years to come. But how did Germany achieve such overwhelming success? How did a nation that had been defeated and humiliated just 20 years earlier rise to field the most advanced army on earth? And what made this campaign so different from every war that came before it? The answers lie in the transformation of warfare itself, in the birth of tactics so revolutionary that they would change the face of battle forever. To understand the lightning that struck Poland, we must first examine the storm that had been brewing across Germany throughout the 1930s. Adolf Hitler had come to power in 1933 with grand ambitions of conquest, but his military inherited the wreckage of the previous war. The Treaty of Versailles had stripped Germany of its tanks, its air force, and much of its army. Yet from this defeat emerged something far more dangerous. German military theorists, studying the stalemate of trench warfare, began developing new concepts that would prioritize speed, concentration, and psychological shock over the grinding attrition of the Western Front. The man who would lead this revolution was not a general, but a former corporal who had survived the trenches of the First World War. Hitler understood that Germany could not afford another prolonged conflict. The nation lacked the resources for a war of attrition. Instead, German strategy would focus on swift, decisive campaigns that would crush enemies before they could mobilize their full strength. This approach required not just new tactics, but entirely new forms of military organization. Central to this transformation was the development of the Panzer divisions. These were not simply collections of tanks, but integrated combined arms formations that merged armor, infantry, artillery, and air support into a single devastating weapon. By September 1939, Germany had organized 6 of these armored divisions, containing approximately 2,400 tanks. While this number might seem modest by later standards, it represented a concentration of mechanized firepower unlike anything the world had seen before. The German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, had grown from nothing into perhaps the most experienced and capable air arm in the world. Tested in the Spanish Civil War, German pilots and aircraft had been honed through actual combat experience. By 1939, the Luftwaffe could deploy over 4,000 aircraft, including the fearsome Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bomber, whose screaming engines would become the signature sound of Blitzkrieg warfare. Yet technology alone could not explain the coming disaster. The true innovation lay in how these weapons would be employed. German military doctrine emphasized the concentration of overwhelming force at decisive points, creating local superiority even when facing numerically superior enemies. Rather than attacking along broad fronts, German forces would punch through enemy lines at carefully selected weak points, then exploit these breaches with rapidly advancing armored spearheads that would disrupt enemy communications, supply lines, and command structures. This doctrine represented a complete rejection of the defensive mindset that had dominated military thinking since the Great War. Where previous conflicts had been about holding ground, Blitzkrieg was about seizing the initiative and maintaining relentless forward momentum. The psychological impact was as important as the physical destruction. Enemy forces would be overwhelmed not just by superior firepower, but by the speed and apparent invincibility of the German advance. Poland, unfortunately, represented the perfect testing ground for these revolutionary tactics. The Polish military, while brave and determined, remained largely organized along traditional lines. Their forces consisted primarily of infantry divisions supported by cavalry brigades, with minimal mechanized elements. Against Germany's concentrated armor and air power, Polish forces would be fighting with the weapons and tactics of the previous war. The strategic situation facing Poland was nearly hopeless from the beginning. German forces had been positioned to attack from 3 directions simultaneously. Army Group North, consisting of the 3rd and 4th Armies, would drive south from East Prussia and Pomerania, cutting off Polish forces in the corridor that separated Germany proper from East Prussia. Army Group South, containing the 8th, 10th and 14th Armies, would surge northward from Silesia and Slovakia, aiming for the Polish capital of Warsaw and the industrial regions of the south. This pincer movement was designed to encircle and destroy Polish forces before they could retreat to more defensible positions. The speed of the German advance would prevent Polish commanders from organizing coherent defensive lines or coordinating counterattacks. By the time Polish forces realized the scope of the threat, German spearheads would already be deep in their rear areas, severing communications and supply lines. The Polish High Command had developed their own strategic plans, but these were based on assumptions that would prove catastrophically wrong. Polish generals believed they could conduct a fighting withdrawal to the southeast, where French and British allies might eventually provide support. They deployed their forces too close to the German border, hoping to defend their industrial regions and population centers. This forward deployment played directly into German hands, allowing the invaders to encircle large Polish formations before they could escape. As the final hours of peace ticked away, both armies made their final preparations. German soldiers cleaned their weapons and checked their equipment, knowing that years of training and preparation were about to be put to the ultimate test. Polish troops stood ready at their posts, many still believing that their allies would quickly come to their aid, that the war would be short and decisive in their favor. The weather on the morning of September 1st was clear and calm, perfect conditions for the kind of mobile warfare the Germans intended to wage. Across the frontier, German officers synchronized their watches and waited for the signal that would unleash the storm. The age of Blitzkrieg was about to begin, and with new and terrible chapter in the history of warfare. In the pre-dawn darkness, final orders were transmitted to unit commanders. Luftwaffe pilots climbed into their cockpits, tank crews started their engines, and infantry battalions formed up in their assembly areas. The machinery of war was primed and ready. All that remained was for the clock to strike the appointed hour, and the lightning would fall upon Poland with devastating force. At precisely 4:45 in the morning, the thunder began. The first shells screamed across the Polish border as German artillery batteries opened fire in coordinated barrages that shook the earth for miles. Within minutes, the sky filled with the drone of approaching aircraft as Luftwaffe bombers swept toward their targets deep inside Poland. The Blitzkrieg had begun, and with it, the world would witness a form of warfare so swift and devastating that it defied comprehension. The opening moments of the campaign unfolded with mechanical precision. German dive bombers plunged from the sky, their sirens wailing as they targeted Polish airfields, communication centers, and transportation hubs. The psychological impact was immediate and terrifying. Soldiers who had never experienced such concentrated aerial assault found themselves paralyzed by the sheer intensity of the bombardment. Entire Polish air squadrons were destroyed on the ground before their pilots could reach their aircraft. Simultaneously, German armored spearheads crashed through Polish frontier defenses like steel hammers shattering glass. The Polish border guards, manning positions designed to delay rather than stop a major offensive, found themselves overwhelmed within hours. German Panzer divisions, supported by motorized infantry and self-propelled artillery, punched through defensive lines that had been expected to hold for days or weeks. The speed of the German advance caught Polish commanders completely off guard. Traditional military wisdom suggested that major offensives required extensive preparation, careful coordination, and methodical progress. But the German war machine operated on entirely different principles. Where conventional attacks might pause to consolidate gains or await supplies, German forces maintained relentless forward momentum, exploiting every breakthrough before defenders could regroup. Polish cavalry units, symbols of national pride and military tradition, found themselves facing an enemy unlike anything in their experience. These mounted warriors, trained for reconnaissance and rapid strikes against infantry formations, encountered German tanks emerging from morning mists like mechanical monsters. The courage of individual Polish cavalrymen could not overcome the technological disparity. Horses and sabers proved useless against steel armor and machine guns. The Luftwaffe's dominance became apparent Within the first hours of combat, German fighters swept Polish aircraft from the skies with devastating efficiency, while bombers ranged freely across the countryside, targeting anything that moved. Railway junctions disappeared under cascading explosives. Military convoys were strafed from above until they became twisted wreckage scattered across country roads. The Polish Air Force, outnumbered nearly 10 with desperate valor but cool to one, fought to not prevent the systematic destruction of their homeland's infrastructure. German tank commanders, many of them veterans of extensive training exercises, found the reality of combat both exhilarating and terrifying. Their panzers rolled through Polish villages, their tracks crushing everything in their path. Resistance was sporadic and poorly coordinated. Polish anti-tank weapons, designed to stop the lighter armored vehicles of the previous war, proved inadequate against the thick steel of German battle tanks. The psychological dimension of Blitzkrieg warfare became as important as its physical destruction. Polish soldiers, trained for methodical defensive operations, found themselves facing an enemy that seemed to appear everywhere simultaneously. German reconnaissance aircraft spotted every movement, directing artillery fire and airstrikes with lethal precision. Communications networks collapsed under the intensity of the bombardment, leaving Polish units isolated and unable to coordinate their responses. Within 72 hours, the carefully planned Polish defensive strategy had completely collapsed. German spearheads had penetrated so deeply into Polish territory that entire army groups found themselves surrounded and cut off from their supply bases. The speed of the advance left no time for organized retreats or the establishment of new defensive lines. Polish commanders discovered that their pre-war assumptions about the nature of modern combat were catastrophically wrong. The industrial city of Kraków fell to German forces on September 6th, barely 5 days after the invasion began. Polish defenders, who had expected weeks to prepare their positions, instead found German tanks rolling through their streets, while Luftwaffe bombers reduced their strongpoints to rubble. The ancient capital of Poland became another symbol of the futility of resisting the German war machine. Polish forces attempted to mount counterattacks wherever possible, but these efforts were hampered by the collapse of their command structure. Without reliable communications, Polish generals could not coordinate their remaining units effectively. Individual battalions fought with tremendous courage, but their isolated resistance could not alter the strategic situation. German air power ensured that any concentration of Polish forces would be immediately detected and destroyed. The refugee crisis began almost immediately as civilian populations fled the advancing German armies. Roads became clogged with families carrying their possessions, making military movement even more difficult for Polish forces. The Luftwaffe showed no mercy to these civilian columns, strafing them from above and adding to the chaos that was consuming the country. By September 8th, German forces were approaching Warsaw, the Polish capital. The speed of their advance had exceeded even the most optimistic German projections. What military planners had estimated might take weeks had been accomplished in just over a week. The Polish government, realizing that their strategic situation was hopeless, began making desperate appeals to their Western allies for immediate military intervention. The Battle of Bzura, beginning on September 9th, represented Poland's last desperate attempt to seize the initiative. General Kutrzeba's army launched a surprise attack against the flank of German forces advancing toward Warsaw. For a brief moment, it seemed that Polish tactical skill and determination might achieve something miraculous. German units were caught off guard, and several divisions suffered heavy casualties as Polish forces demonstrated that they could still fight effectively when given the opportunity. The initial success of the Polish counteroffensive sent shockwaves through German headquarters. For the first time since the invasion began, the momentum of Blitzkrieg warfare had been disrupted. Polish forces captured thousands of German prisoners and destroyed significant numbers of tanks and artillery pieces. The victory seemed to prove that the German war machine was not invincible. However, the German response demonstrated the true flexibility of their military doctrine. Rather than reinforcing failure or attempting to hold untenable positions, German commanders immediately began redirecting forces from other sectors to contain the Polish breakthrough. Luftwaffe squadrons were concentrated against the advancing Polish columns, while Panzer divisions raced to encircle the attacking forces. The air power advantage that had dominated the entire campaign now focused its fury on the Polish offensive. Stuka dive bombers screamed down from the sky in endless waves, their precision bombing devastating Polish formations that had been forced to operate in open terrain. Without air cover of their own, Polish forces found themselves completely vulnerable to attack from above. Within days, the Polish counteroffensive at Bzura had transformed from triumph to catastrophe. German reinforcements arrived with the mechanical precision that characterized their entire military machine. Tank divisions that had been advancing on other fronts suddenly appeared on the flanks of the Polish attack, their commanders having received new orders through radio networks that functioned with devastating efficiency. The Polish forces, extended and exposed, found themselves facing the same encirclement tactics that had destroyed so many of their comrades. The collapse came swiftly and brutally. Polish generals who had briefly tasted victory watched their formations disintegrate under the combined pressure of ground assault and aerial bombardment. The Luftwaffe concentrated its full attention on the Bzura battlefield, turning the river valley into a killing ground where nothing could move without being spotted and destroyed from above. Artillery barrages, coordinated by forward air controllers, reduced Polish positions to moonscapes of churned earth and twisted metal. By September 15th, the last organized Polish resistance in the Bzura pocket had been eliminated. 3 Polish generals lay dead among the ruins of their commands, their armies scattered or captured. The brief flicker of hope that had illuminated Polish resistance was extinguished, leaving only the grim reality of total defeat. German forces resumed their relentless advance toward Warsaw, their confidence in Blitzkrieg tactics completely restored. The speed of German operations had created logistical challenges that revealed both the strengths and limitations of their revolutionary approach to warfare. Supply columns struggled to keep pace with advancing tank formations, forcing German commanders to rely heavily on captured Polish fuel and ammunition. The consumption of resources was staggering, with some estimates suggesting that 6 weeks of combat consumed 8 months' worth of normal peacetime supplies. Yet these logistical strains did nothing to slow the German advance. Wehrmacht quartermasters had planned for exactly this kind of rapid consumption, stockpiling vast quantities of fuel, ammunition, and spare parts in forward depots. The German war economy had been geared towards supporting short, intensive campaigns rather than prolonged conflicts. Every aspect of their military machine reflected the doctrine of swift, decisive victory. Warsaw itself became the symbol of Polish resistance as German forces closed around the capital. The city's defenders, a mixture of regular army units and hastily organized civilian volunteers, prepared for a siege that would test the limits of human endurance. Streets were barricaded with overturned trams and automobiles. Windows were blocked with sandbags and furniture. Every intersection became a potential fortress. The German assault on Warsaw demonstrated another dimension of Blitzkrieg warfare. Rather than attempting costly urban combat, German forces established a tight siege, while the Luftwaffe systematically reduced the city through aerial bombardment. Day after day, waves of bombers dropped their deadly cargo on military positions, government buildings, and industrial facilities. The psychological pressure on the civilian population was immense and deliberate. Polish defenders fought with desperate courage, knowing that surrender meant the end of their nation's independence. Snipers picked off German soldiers from ruined buildings. Anti-tank teams armed with improvised explosives stalked German armor through the rubble-strewn streets. Every block extracted its price in German blood, proving that even the most advanced military machine could be slowed by determined urban defenders. However, the strategic situation remained hopeless. German forces controlled all approaches to the capital, preventing any possibility of relief or resupply. Food and ammunition dwindled with each passing day. Medical supplies ran critically short as hospitals overflowed with wounded soldiers and civilians. The city's infrastructure collapsed under the relentless bombardment, leaving entire districts without water, electricity, or communications. The German siege tactics revealed the calculating brutality that would characterize their occupation policies. Civilian areas were deliberately targeted to break the population's will to resist. Hospitals and schools disappeared under cascading bombs. Refugee columns attempting to flee the city were strafed by low-flying aircraft. The message was clear: resistance would bring only suffering and death. As September drew to a close, reports reached German headquarters of Soviet forces massing on Poland's eastern frontier. The Nazi-Soviet pact, signed just weeks before the invasion, had included secret protocols dividing Poland between the two totalitarian powers. Stalin had been waiting for the opportune moment to claim his share of the spoils, and that moment was rapidly approaching. On September 17th, the final blow fell upon Poland's already shattered defenses. Over 400,000 Soviet troops, supported by thousands of tanks and aircraft, cross-border in the eastern a carefully core forces, already nated assault. Polish, decimated by nearly 3 weeks of combat against the Germans, now faced a second front that made any hope of continued resistance impossible. The Soviet invasion struck Polish forces, who had been attempting to establish defensive positions along the Bug River. These troops, many of them retreating remnants from battles fought hundreds of miles to the west, possessed neither the equipment nor the organization necessary to resist a fresh enemy. Soviet tank columns rolled through Polish positions with the same devastating efficiency that German panzers had demonstrated throughout the campaign. Polish commanders found themselves trapped between two advancing armies, each employing tactics that made traditional defensive warfare obsolete. Radio communications, already disrupted by German jamming and bombing, now carried desperate messages from units reporting Soviet attacks from east. The planned withdrawal to southeastern Poland, where Western allies might potentially provide support, became impossible as Soviet forces seized the intended refuge areas. The psychological impact of the Soviet invasion was as devastating as its military consequences. Polish soldiers who had been fighting desperately against German forces suddenly realized that their country faced complete partition. The hope that sustained them through weeks of brutal combat evaporated as reports arrived of Soviet tanks rolling through cities that had been considered safe havens just hours before. German and Soviet forces, despite their ideological differences, coordinated their operations with remarkable efficiency. Both armies understood that swift victory required preventing Polish forces from establishing coherent defensive lines anywhere in the country. Radio communications between German and Soviet commanders ensured that neither army would accidentally engage the other while pursuing retreating Polish units. The ancient fortress city of Brest-Litovsk became a symbol of this coordination when German forces, having captured the city from Polish defenders, ceremonially handed it over to advancing Soviet troops. The joint parade that followed demonstrated to the world that Poland had been divided between two totalitarian powers whose temporary alliance had sealed the country's fate. Polish resistance continued in scattered pockets throughout the country, but these isolated actions could not alter the strategic outcome. Individual units fought with suicidal bravery, knowing that defeat was inevitable but refusing to surrender their honor. Tank crews fought their obsolete machines until ammunition ran out, then continued fighting with small arms. Infantry companies held village crossroads against overwhelming odds, buying time for civilians to escape but achieving no strategic purpose. The final act of organized Polish resistance centered on the Hel Peninsula, where naval units and coastal fortifications continued firing at German positions even as the rest of the country collapsed. These defenders, supplied by sea and protected by coastal guns, represented the last vestige of Polish military lasted until power. Their resistance October 2nd, more than a month after the invasion began, demonstrating the courage that might have changed history under different circumstances. Warsaw's surrender on September 27th marked the effective end of the Polish campaign, though isolated fighting would continue for several more days. The capital's defenders, starved and exhausted, could no longer maintain their positions against the relentless German bombardment. White flags appeared over the ruins of government buildings as Polish commanders accepted the inevitable. The final statistics of the campaign revealed both the effectiveness of Blitzkrieg tactics and the tremendous cost paid by Poland. German casualties totaled approximately 14,000 killed and 30,000 wounded from a force of over 1 million men. Polish losses were catastrophically higher, with 66,000 dead, 130,000 wounded, and 400,000 captured from an army of 800,000. These numbers, however, failed to capture the true devastation inflicted upon Poland. The campaign had demonstrated that modern warfare could destroy entire nations with unprecedented speed and efficiency. The age of lightning war had begun, and with it came the realization that traditional concepts of military defense had become obsolete overnight. The Luftwaffe's terror bombing campaign against Polish cities revealed the true nature of this new form of warfare. This was not merely conquest, but annihilation. German pilots received orders to target civilian populations deliberately, transforming ancient cities into infernos of destruction. The bombing of Wilonia began before any declaration of war, with German aircraft reducing the defenseless town to rubble while its inhabitants slept. Frampol disappeared entirely under cascading explosives, its medieval architecture obliterated in minutes of concentrated bombing. These attacks served a calculated purpose beyond mere destruction. German strategists understood that modern warfare was as much psychological as physical. By terrorizing civilian populations, they hoped to break the will of entire nations before their armies could mount effective resistance. The screaming dive of Stuka bombers became the signature sound of German conquest, their wailing sirens designed specifically to induce panic among those who heard them approaching. The civilian toll mounted with each passing day, as German forces demonstrated their contempt for the traditional laws of war. Machine gun fire from low-flying aircraft cut down fleeing refugees on country roads. Artillery bombardments deliberately targeted hospitals and schools. The message was unmistakable. Resistance would bring only suffering and death to innocent populations. Polish forces, despite facing impossible odds, continued fighting with desperate courage that amazed even their enemies. In the ruins of Warsaw, civilian volunteers joined regular soldiers in constructing makeshift fortifications from overturned trams and rubble. Teenagers armed with Molotov cocktails stalked German tanks through smoke-filled streets. Elderly men who remembered the previous war stood guard at improvised barricades, their hunting rifles useless against modern armor, but their spirits unbroken. The campaign that began on September 1st had ended not in 9 days, as some would claim, but in 36 brutal days that changed warfare forever. Poland's defeat was total, yet their resistance had revealed the true cost of Blitzkrieg warfare. German forces, despite their overwhelming victory, had consumed resources at an unprecedented rate and suffered casualties that exceeded their most pessimistic projections. The lightning war that crushed Poland was indeed revolutionary, but it had also shown the world that even the most advanced military machine could bleed when faced with determined defenders fighting for their homeland's survival.